Thank you all for being at this virtual gathering of the oldest independent bookstore in Los Angeles. We're 80 years old. And the best part of owning a bookstore, aside from the rivers of money that flow in from owning a bookstore, is the opportunity to have interesting people, authors, thinkers, talk about things that matter. And of all the times to have the conversation we're going to have tonight, I couldn't imagine anything more timely than this discussion about race and justice as we watch the news and think to ourselves, can this be happening again? So let me introduce briefly our interlocutor, Lara Bazelon, who is a clinical professor at the University of San Francisco Law School. She has spent an enormous amount of time in the real world, clerking as a law clerk for one of my legal heroes, Harry Pragerson. And then she worked in the Federal Public Defender's Office in Los Angeles, where some of my best friends are working. And she is particularly interested in and directs criminal, juvenile justice, and racial justice clinics. So hands-on, not simply an idea factory for academics. The author tonight, whose book is N Theory, he'll understand why I have shortened it here, Race, Language, Unequal Justice, and the Law, is one of the most important professors in the United States writing on questions of law and justice. He's thoughtful, controversial, funny, and this book in particular I found to be eye-opening. If you are interested at all in the subject matter, you will find yourself awakened at every page, sometimes in strong disagreement, other times with this sort of revelation that I can't believe that it didn't dawn on me until now. And you'll see the interplay as he talks this evening, I hope, about the importance of who the district attorney is, which he often describes as the public defender with power, talks about what it means to be radically progressive, and talk about how this system has to change and why at its root we have to deal with the questions of race and moral blameworthiness, and how all of that intersects with something as simple as luck. So I'll stop talking now and listen to this conversation. Maybe after 40 or so minutes of back and forth, we'll have some time for questions, which I will invite people to either do through chat or by raising their hand and being called on. But thank you both for being here, and I'm so eager to hear this conversation. So I'll turn it over to you, Lara, to kick it off.
Thank you, Bert, for that incredibly generous introduction. And thank you all for coming tonight. It's a huge honor for me to be in conversation with Professor Armour, who is all the things that Bert said and more. And I'm just going to basically dive in because I think you did an excellent job introducing and laying the groundwork. So let's just start with the title, which is provocative. You call it the double-edged epithet. In fact, this title is so provocative that I don't think that I can say it. But I'm thinking that maybe you can, and you can tell us why you chose it and what it means in terms of the legal theories you're talking about in your book.
Thanks, Laura, for being my interlocutor tonight, and Bert, of course, and Chevalier Books for hosting this. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this book and its ideas at this critical moment. I use the N-word, nigger theory, that really jagged-edged epithet, blood-stained with deep roots in racial oppression of the extremist sort, chattel slavery, is something that's been used to demonize, monsterize, and otherize Black people for hundreds of years. and it carries that freight, I understand, for many people, and so I use it advisedly. However, I also know that in the hands of some Black artists and writers, it has been used, back to your double-edged point, it has been used not as a term of opprobrium, not as a tool to distinguish and distance them from us, but rather as a term of endearment, as an expression of solidarity. As when someone like Tupac Shakur says in one of his dirges, how many brothers fell victim to the street, rest in peace, young nigga, there's a heaven for a G. Be alive, I told you that I never thought of death. My niggas, we the last ones left. When he's using the N-word there, he's using it as a term of solidarity. He's saying, I recognize that we are both members of a social category that they otherize and demonize. I find brotherhood with you in that understanding and consciousness, but you're still my nigga. You know, that label they're throwing at us, I can find within it solidarity in our shared oppression, but our shared triumph over that oppression, my nigga, right? So it's a word that has no fixed and frozen meaning, but a malleable one that can be used as a term of the kind of vilest, derogatory insult that you can come up with on the one hand, and as a term of endearment on the other. And I'll just say this, Laura, to give it the other definition real quick, because that's important to the title of the book. And you were asking about it, and it's, you know, there are a lot of reasons I use the N-word. Another one has to do with Chris Rock using the N-word in its ugliest, most vicious, most derogatory sense. When he said in a famous routine that launched his comedic career, Bring the Pain, in 1996, he goes back and forth in front of an all-Black audience and says, it's like a civil war going on in Black America, and there's two sides. There are Black people and there are niggas, and niggas have got to go. I love Black people, but I hate niggas. Boy, I wish they'd let me join the Ku Klux Klan. Should I do a drive-by from here to Brooklyn? And he goes on like that for 30 minutes. And his core definition of a so-called nigga is a Black, morally condemnable Black criminal. So by his definition, the up to 90% of young Black males in some of these inner city neighborhoods who are going to wind up in jail, on probation, on parole at some point in their lives are morally condemnable niggas that we should distinguish and distance ourselves from and make the butt of our jokes and our politics of us, them, that jokes are all about, and accepting the punchline through laughter as a way of saying, oh yeah, those bad Negroes, those Black criminals are worthy of our derision. And I want to attack that use of the N-word as a way of otherizing Blacks because of their record of criminal wrongdoing, as well as a term that Blacks can use to try to suture the places where blood flows. Yes, the word has been used to open wounds by non-Blacks and even Blacks like Chris Rock, but in the hands of other caring Blacks, those same words can be used to suture the places where blood flows.
So it's a really interesting point, because your book is not just about race, it's about class. I mean, that's kind of, I feel like, what you're getting at, which is this idea that there's the good Black person and then there's the bad Black person. This is really Manichaean universe with a dichotomy. And I think that you're using the N-word to sort of say, that's a fool's errand to draw those distinctions for any number of reasons. And you talk about, I think, it being propelled to some degree by what you call a retributive urge. Yeah. And I wonder, you say it's illegitimate and irrational. Where do you think it comes from? Is that just sort of an innate human urge? Is that an urge of a struggling people to try to keep going up and then distance themselves from people who they feel like are dragging them down? How do you explain that?
Yeah, the retributive urge, Laura, I would say it's very human. You know, my son, my oldest son, Allende, while he was at school, was at a party thrown in his apartment, and his roommate found someone who wasn't supposed to be there going through his backpack, told him to get out. As he was going out the door, being escorted out the door, he pulled a gun from his belt and shot across the room, hitting my roommate, who was standing right next to my son, only about 6 inches from him, in the chest. Fortunately, he didn't die, but the bullet is still in him because it's in a delicate place they couldn't get to. He's healthy and walking around. It could have been much more tragic. Had that happened, had that bullet hit my son, I would have had an extremely strong retributive urge. I would have been outraged, enraged, all right? And I would have wanted retaliation and revenge because I would not have been in a state of reflective equilibrium. You know, I would have been in the heat of passion, you know, of having lost a loved one, bereavement. And I understand that, and that's a human emotion we have to understand. But we have to understand justice is not just human emotions. Justice is also principles. Justice is also commitments we make to treat people with dignity and a certain level of respect, even if they do things we don't like, even if they do things that are wrong. So I think the retributive urge is natural as probably any urge I can imagine. You know, initially, I may be just speaking as a member of this culture. I think there are a lot of cultures in which people have the retributive urge and they satisfy it. It's hard to go to the movies without watching a plot that doesn't invite you to watch some kind of revenge. Somebody gets his comeuppance, you know, and you feel good about him getting or her their comeuppance, and sometimes you want them to die slow, you know, the protagonist will say that, and you'll be, you know, cheering along. That's the retributive urge, and you're indulging it. And now you're looking over here at the criminal justice system, and you're going to suddenly turn it into, you're going to turn away from retribution, retaliation, and revenge, and start feeling, oh, well, restorative justice and rehabilitation and reconciliation, and I understand redemption. I think it's going to be very difficult to switch back and forth, and so that's why, yeah, I think unfortunately retributive urge is primal, and we stoke it as a part of our cultural belief system and a way that we do things culturally day in and day out. And I'm arguing in this book we need to change that.
So I'm going to press you a little bit on this point, because not only did your son have a near miss, you've had your own recent interaction with the police, I guess, for the crime of trying to go collect your mail,
Yes.
Which the result of you walking out of your house in your neighborhood to get your mail was you being wrongfully suspected of some kind of a shooting and being locked in a patrol car. And so you talk about this experience in the book, and then you talk about how they realized that you are the quote unquote safe Negro, and the ticker tape is kind of going in their brains as they're reassessing you and deciding that you're safe to release. But I'm curious to know what you were feeling as this is happening to you, because here you are, you have these Ivy League degrees, you have a chair at one of the best law schools in the country, you know, you're living in this really nice neighborhood. It doesn't sort of get any better in terms of a success story, and yet you are just as vulnerable to this incredibly degrading, humiliating treatment. So I'm curious to know, in that moment, are you thinking about things like restorative and transformative justice? Or are you more thinking about, I want revenge, or are you thinking something else?
Yeah, I want revenge, number one. I did, but actually, initially, but I controlled that some. I went into a kind of eye of the storm and sat back in that little cage they put me in the back of that car as they set up a SWAT team to go through the house and look for a non-existent body that they were sure was somewhere in the house and kept asking me about. I was sure at that point that, you know, this was a gross miscarriage of justice, but I wasn't upset about it as I might otherwise have been, because I realized that I was in a lot of ways very privileged. I was going to come out of this all right, which I did. I stepped out of the back seat when they found no wrongdoing, like a chick, you know, from his shell at Easter time, stretching my legs and counting my blessings, you know, so it was a happy ending. But I thought about how many other tragic endings there are, and how, even though in one sense my race didn't insulate me from the black tax, in another my class did. The fact that they were up in this kind of upper middle class black neighborhood, it's called the Black Beverly Hills. You know, he looks, at the time I was being mistaken for a homeless person a lot by police and others. And so he looks like he doesn't belong. I came out in my, you know, in jeans and no shirt. So he looks like he might be a home invader. So we're presuming he is. We heard a gunshot in the neighborhood, but we don't know if we're wrong. And it turns out that he may be, oh, I don't know, a judge, let's say, or some respectable Negro. We don't want to have too much egg on our face. So they didn't go as far as they might have if I weren't up in this neighborhood. So I understood that my class helped to insulate me some, but often your class doesn't. You cannot reduce race to class, because very often, as Stevie Wonder said in one of his most trenchant lyrics, you might make big cash, but you cannot cash in your face. And the face of crime for millions and millions of Americans, most Americans, is Black. And so you just understand that there's going to be profiling and stereotyping that's going to come with, you know, living in the skin we're in, and understand that Black tax as the price you pay. But I also try to see it as a tithe you pay. Every time you pay the Black tax, you're tithing the Black underclass as a member of the Black bourgeoisie, because you should have a moment of zen and think, I'm being profiled because mostly truly disadvantaged Blacks are turning disproportionately to crime, because the crime rates of middle-class whites and middle-class Blacks is the same, roughly. So when Chris Rock says, I love Black people, I hate niggas, he's saying, what she's really saying is, I love disproportionately middle-class Blacks and hate disproportionately truly disadvantaged Blacks. That's what he's really saying. You have a class distinction masquerading as a moral distinction. That's what he's really saying, right? And that's what I'm trying to kind of get at with this analysis that we're going along with, Laura, that, you know, I want to make sure that the class dimensions are recognized and important. And so when people come up to my neighborhood from, the Jungle, Watts, Compton, other neighborhoods where truly disadvantaged Blacks reside, I've heard my neighbors say, when they visited my sons for parties and me for events, I've heard my neighbors say, come and tell me point blank, we don't want Compton up here. I've heard the sheriff's deputy say, we don't want South Central up here, even though we are in South Central. What they mean is up here in the hills with you middle-class Blacks. And so, you know, I understand that class is very important to this analysis, but I'm just saying you also can't reduce race to class, because like you said, with all my degrees, I still got niggerized in the eyes of law enforcement and routinely get niggerized in the eyes of law enforcement.
So this is an interesting point, because you're also saying that even within the Black community, there's this idea that the monsterization of people who are African-American and who are disadvantaged and who are gonna maybe commit crimes are basically sort of disposable, and, you know, basically you could kind of write them off. And what's interesting to me about that, I mean, there's so many ways to kind of slice that, but it also, again, goes directly to your story, because that's exactly what happened to your dad. I mean, your dad was just written off and disposed of. And I think your dad's story kind of goes to the falsity of that idea. And I was wondering if you could talk about your dad and kind of what happened to him.
Thanks, Laura. Well, you know, there are a lot of downsides to Zoom, but one of the upsides is that, you know, I happen to be at my own home, and I can show you my dad's typewriter that he used to type his way out of prison. A manual Royal typewriter. He was given 22 to 55 years for possession and sale of marijuana in 1968 for the real underlying crime of being an uppity Black man. That was the real underlying offense. They railroaded him on some trumped up marijuana possession and sale charges that he ultimately proved were trumped up when he vindicated himself in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. But it took him 5 years to do so. And in the meantime, you know, we went from a, you know, kind of Huxtable standard of living, Dr. Huxtable standard of living, middle-class living, to basically crumbs and roaches and rats. But rather than accept his fate of having to spend 22 to 55 years of his life, and because he was an uppity Negro, he was much more likely to do the 55 than the 22, right? Rather than resign himself to that fate, not that anybody does, but sometimes you don't know what the hell you're going to do, he reached up and started pulling books down from the warden's own library shelves and taught himself constitutional law, and criminal procedure, then started writing his own writs of habeas corpus with this typewriter I'm going to show you.
Yeah.
Represented himself pro se up through the state system, through the federal system, until we were over in, I'll show it to you first, until we were over in, there's the Royal typewriter. He typed all his writs of habeas corpus and everything else out on his cell floor. And I was standing with him in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, arguing for an en banc panel of judges, literally for his life. And I teach his case now in my criminal law class, Armour versus Salisbury, which stands for the proposition. You would have thought this had been established before his case, but you shepherdized his case for this proposition now, because his was one of the first to establish it, that it's a denial of constitutional due process for the state through its DA to lie to the jury deliberately and intentionally to get a conviction against a defendant. That's a constitutional violation. It took him 5 years of his life to establish that as a constitutional violation, right? And as a result of that, I got to see, though, firsthand that in Cincinnati, of all places, by the way, which is where the Underground Railroad comes up. So I'm standing with him in a town where Black bodies in bondage are often liberated, and his was one of those latter-day Black bodies in bondage that was liberated in Cincinnati, you know. But I realized from his experience early on the power of language, which is another reason I have the N-word in here. I hope that it constantly provokes critical reflection on the power of language. All he had between him and rotting in a jail cell was word work. That's all he had, putting words and sentences together in a certain order. And the next thing you know, he had the key to his jailhouse door that he was pulling out of the warden's own law books, right? And so that's why I have a chapter in the book, and I spend so much time in the book thinking critically, self-reflecting on how I use language, on the nature of language more generally, and on the nature of linguistic, non-linguistic, symbolic communication. So we're talking about not only language, but my choice of political fashion, like my hair, you know, like Confederate monuments, like, you know, statues, like flags, like everything under the sun.
So I'm really glad that you brought this up, because I think of you not just as an academic, but I think of you as an artist, as a performative artist. And I'm gonna ask you a question that I did not plan to ask, but I can't help but notice just how beautiful the art is on your walls. And since you gave us a little bit of a tour, I'm wondering if there's one particular painting that you wanna just talk to us about, why it's on the wall, who painted it, and what it speaks to, especially if it connects with your book.
Oh, heck yeah, thank you. Laura, because I don't get to feature this gentleman enough. All of this art up here, this, for example, all of this art, let me see if I can center it for you, is by a guy named Aaron Waugh. All this art in here, and I have downstairs in, you know, this is just where I have my students come over and they put on, you know, kind of, art and justice events and stuff, but downstairs I have, and you know, kind of where in the living space is, there's also a lot of Aaron Waugh paintings. And why they're down there is because Aaron Waugh is a Black Venice Beach painter who was just fabulous. He's an abstract expressionist, as you can see, and he had some stuff that was shown in the LA Museum of LACMA, rather, LA County Museum of Art, and he was well regarded around the city. He got into a minor kind of misunderstanding with the guy who his former wife was with. He was interacting with his daughter in a way he thought was inappropriate. So he confronted the guy. The police were called. He spent some time in jail. while he was in jail, he had a medical emergency, and the medical services in California at that time were so bad that they were declared unconstitutional in violation of the 8th Amendment. You may remember that. That's how bad the medical care in California was.
Yes, I do.
Yes, under that medical care, they performed an operation on him, and he was rendered damn near quadriplegic. They called it a paraplegic, but he could do very little. So all this art is now lost to us forever, right? Robbed from him by this obscene system of locking up people for no good reason and then giving them subpar medical care, which is what we're doing with COVID-19 now, right? The same kind of thing, subpar medical care. We just don't give a damn about them. And that's the other reason I use the N-word. We, as a society, otherize, monsterize, demonize, niggerize criminals, you know, and we don't give a damn about their welfare. We think of them as so much toxic human waste, and we allow them to be mistreated and dumped and warehoused. And until we deal with that, we're never going to really, I don't think, get at this, you know, problem making deep cuts of mass incarceration.
I agree. I'm curious to know whether you think, I mean, I want to talk a little bit about you as an artist and how you think about translating the things that you care about into performative art and not just, you know, lecturing from the podium. And I'm curious to know whether you feel like that way of expressing yourself is not only sort of cathartic and therapeutic and creative in a way that's satisfying for you personally, but also forces people to kind of reconceptualize basic premises that they have. So I'm just going to kind of talk about a specific example, which is Race, Rap, and Redemption, which is this play, this kind of metaphysical play that you first, I think, put on in 2007 at USC. And I'm curious to know how that was received. I kind of know, but I want you to talk about it. And then if you've performed it since and what the function of it is.
Yeah, the Race, Rap, and Redemption really illustrates all I tried to talk about in Nigga Theory earlier on, all right? In that the point of the play was to, and at Bovard, which we had roughly 1,100 students that night in Bovard Auditorium on USC's campus. And what I asked them to consider for the evening, the call to the question for the night was, should we pour liquor for Tukey? All right, and Bert represented Stanley Tukey Williams, an icon, all right, in so many ways. I can't even start to go into all the ways that he is iconic, but the reason I asked then, should we pour liquor for Tukey, was he'd just been put to death on death row, San Quentin. Arnold Schwarzenegger was sitting as governor, and he denied any stay request on the ground that, Tukey's petition, on the ground that Tukey Williams did not achieve personal redemption. He set that out as the legal standard and said, no, he did not achieve personal redemption. So I asked, should we pour liquor for, we collected folks at USC, okay, all 1,100 of us in an urban setting. So I have a tough jury going in because in urban settings, there's more crime. And so when you're around people who are around crime, sometimes they can be especially judgmental about it because they're worried about it, right? And so I knew this was kind of a tough audience in that way. And what this essentially turned into then, the play consisted of was a closing argument for the damned. You know, should we pour liquor for Tukey, i.e. should we participate in a libation ceremony and ritualistically reach out to him in sympathetic solidarity, which is what, you know, libation ceremonies are all about. You say Ashe, you bring their spirit to be with you. And by the way, let's be clear, I'm not talking about a low-level nonviolent drug offender. I'm talking about a cold-blooded first-degree murder by his own admission. He didn't say he killed those particular people. He never admitted that, but he said, I've done equivalent things, okay? So we don't get into, you know, a lot of quibbling about that. He really was, I'm gonna assume going forward with, you know, in the play, because my, you know, for reason I go into the book, I won't go right now into them much more. So I wanted that on the board first, that we're going to assume that he, number one, did those crimes, and number two, co-founded the Crips. Co-founded the Crips and unleashed, in the estimation or opinion of some, maybe many, unleashed the destruction of or helped unleash the destruction that the gang wars led to, etc. Right? So I said, should we pour liquor for him? All right, should we stand in solidarity with him? Now, what I knew for sure is if I was going to bring them around to that kind of position, I wasn't going to do it just by throwing a lot of propositional content at them. I was going to do it with a lot of lawyers' arguments, okay? That wasn't going to do it. You know, I was going to have to, as Bert pointed out earlier, when we were talking offline, I was going to have to bring them a narrative, an alternative narrative that reached their hearts and minds and changed their hearts and minds about this person. And to do that, I was going to need art. So I brought in artists. I brought in people like Lula Washington's dance company doing a modern dance interpretation of Tupac Shakur's Brenda's Got a Baby, about a 12-year-old Black girl who's raped and then has a baby, or community turns their back on her. And the last couplet says, prostitute found slain and Brenda's her name. She had a baby. She finally had to turn to that to try to, you know, scratch out a living. And we asked, what if the baby that Brenda had was Stanley Tukey Williams? And he goes into the foster care system, which so many of them do. He's, you know, cigarette burns. He's being disciplined by being thrown into car trunks for 2 and 3 hours at a time, 4 hours at a time. And so now we have to sit in judgment on him. Then I had other artistic performers like Saul Williams, Maida DeBarrier, Lula Washington's dance company. I said dance company already. Macy Gray's music orchestra, doing a Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is a solidarity song, Black national anthem, and a hip hop version, and then a standard version. And headlining it, wrapping it all up, was Ice Cube, because I wanted gangster rap to be at the heart. And he came out and he talked about one of the things after he performed the songs that he is famous for. He talked about how when he would perform some of these songs on stage, he would be arrested. And let me give you an example of the songs that he would perform on stage, and they would come out and put him in handcuffs. And then maybe you can see why I oppose hate speech codes. And contrary to some of my critical race studies friends, I am not in favor of most forms of speech regulation. He said, Ice Cube, that the police would tell him, you utter the words, F the police. When you start that song, when you start to go into that song, we're going to come out and arrest you. Now listen to the lyrics of Fuck the Police. Fuck the police coming straight from the underground. A young nigga got it bad because I'm brown and not the other colors, so police think they have the authority to kill a minority. And he goes on like that. Tell me that's not political speech. Tell me he's not anticipating, you know, the grievances of Black Lives Matter 20 years later. Why are you locking him up for political expression, artistic expression? And they do that a lot, by the way. There's a case here in California and LA where they're using rappers' lyrics against them in trial all the time. So, you know, for that reason, I am very wary about giving any other decision maker the power to crack down on speech and forms of expression, because you know what they're going to do? They're going to turn around and use it on me. They may start out using it on the KKK. You know, you give them an easy case. But before long, and I've seen this over and over, they're going to say, you know what? Blue lives matter. And this person's out here, you know, talking bad about blue lives. That's hate speech. And you know, Armour, you know, he's hanging out with Black Lives Matter a lot. I think he's a Black identity extremist. You know, and so you just don't want to give, you know, anybody the power. I'm reluctant to give them the power to start regulating speech, because they're going to use it against dissidents and dissenters, and especially socially marginalized ones like myself.
So I want to leave time for questions, and so I want to be mindful of that. but I can't help but ask you this to change the conversation a little bit, to make it more current. You have some very strong critiques in your book of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. I should add parenthetically, me too. I don't think that when you wrote the book, you could have imagined that they would be the face of the Democratic ticket, but here they are. And I'm curious to know your thoughts about how they've evolved or how they haven't evolved. And let's assume that there is a Democratic victory. What are your thoughts about the two of them being the face of criminal justice reform?
Yeah, it's a scary face. As far as evolution, you know, a lot say they have evolved. You can point to a lot of things that Kamala Harris has done lately that are much more progressive, no doubt about it. She still continues, though, to lie about her past. She continues to call herself a progressive prosecutor. In no sense, I'm not saying she was, you know, the most regressive prosecutor ever. I'm not saying that. I'm saying she was a traditional law and order kind of prosecutor, centrist maybe, you know, maybe a policy here or two, a SOP here or two, but a lot of stuff that is jaw-dropping, laughing in the face of somebody that asks you about marijuana legalization, and you know, when you know how much the Black community bears the brunt of the enforcement of all that stuff, and it's real clear and it's out there on the record, and you know that, and you're going to do that. So, you know, to continue to call yourself a progressive prosecutor is just a lie. What you should do, and your record is going to be there to contradict you and constantly throw shade on your authenticity. What you should do is simply own your record, own your past. Say, times were different, things were different. I remember, wasn't it Obama? I think there were a lot of liberal firebrands who weren't at one time for same-sex marriage, you know, would duck and dodge and go all around it, you know, and so, you know, they regretted, you know, they look back and say, that was I wasn't a leader, I was just kind of following. Well, you can say the same thing. I have insights now that I lacked then, you know. The Overton window is shifted. Going forward, we're going to get it right. You know, if you did that, right, the honesty would go a long way. You know, that's the authenticity for me. You know, but the idea that at the top of the ticket, at a time when you have people out in the streets for weeks on end, after week, about law enforcement misconduct. And a lot of that is due not only to the officers themselves, but to the DAs who don't hold them accountable. All right, and she's not especially known for that either. And at a time like this, to have at the top of the ticket, Joe Biden, who I don't think it's an exaggeration to call one of the architects of racialized mass incarceration, all right? And somebody who was ready to lock up parents for the truancy of their kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I want to go down a long list. And, you know, I do in the book, you know, I show the receipts in the book, you know, of things she did that were not a progressive prosecutor wouldn't have done. And so that leaves Black folk once again, you know, to be told, well, what's your choice? You know, Trump is Hitler, you know, and so you have you have law enforcement at the top of the ticket. You know, okay, so what? It's better than Hitler, right? So lesser of two evils, right? Hold your nose. And many feel like it's really more like the evil of two lessers. That's what you're really throwing at us. But okay, here we go again. And you know, here's my concern. I don't think you know, it's going to make, for example, a lot of the folk I talk to go vote for Trump. No, it's just my concern is the enthusiasm. If you're going to stand in line 6 or 9 hours in the face of voter suppression and all the other kinds of stuff they're throwing at you, I mean, you got to be motivated. You got to, like, you know, yes, you know, this is somebody who's going to represent me. right? And show that they care. And not if you don't see that, I'm just worried about that. You know, if there's not enough enthusiasm to get the people out that need to be, that you need to get out.
I hear you. I hear you. There's so many other questions I want to ask you, but I'm mindful that there are other people who might want to ask questions. So Bert, should I turn it over to you for that?
Well, I have a question, and then I'll turn it over to Kelsey, who is the grand keeper of these things.
Okay.
In the many interesting parts of the book and surprising parts of the book, one of my favorites was your discussion of luck and moral blameworthiness. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about those two concepts, their intersection, and how the criminal justice system gets that wrong.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely crucial, Bert, because in order to take the footing from the retributive urge, in order to take the ground right out from under it, I want to take away the ability to morally condemn others, right? If I say all your moral condemnations of others are illegitimate and irrational, I'm hoping that you'll engage in some critical self-reflection, start to accept more epistemic humility, and start to curb your own retributive urge, start to tame it some, long enough to have some other good things happen. So one of the ways that I talk about later. So one of the ways I get at that is by talking about the moral luck phenomenon that we as law professors know very well. When I first started teaching torts, it was the first thing I recognized. And in criminal law, it's all over the place, you know. And so we were doing it as lawyers way before I saw any philosophers talking about it. And then when I looked into it a little further, I saw Thomas Nagel and Bernard Williams were doing it over on the philosophy section and looking at it more seriously. And so I started studying them. But you know, as lawyers, we know, for example, that in criminal law, you can have two people driving down the same street being just as negligent, just as inattentive, looking at their phone, messing with somebody in the back seat, eating, in some way not keeping a proper lookout. They're both doing the exact same negligent act. And in fact, thousands, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people every day do lots of unnecessarily risky things behind the wheel. Anytime you don't keep a proper lookout, anytime you speed, anytime you do anything that's not within the rules, you are taking excessive risks, right? And one of those while you're taking those excessive risks, not keeping a proper lookout, whatever, as happens thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of times every day, most people go home after doing all that and they sit back and say, you know, we had a good day. You know, nothing happened, hon. How about with you, right? But once in a while, a kid will dart out from between two cars. And had they been keeping a proper lookout, they would have been able to stop in time. But because they weren't, they hit the kid or pedestrian and caused their death. Now they've gone from they could have been doing the exact same thing that someone was coming down the same street was doing just 5 minutes earlier, but no kid jumped out from between two cars. The first one who didn't hit anybody because no kid jumped out, they're sitting at home, you know, enjoying their dinner. This one could be looking at, in California, 6 years, up to 6 years for vehicular manslaughter. It's at least looking at negligent homicide, maybe manslaughter, is on a moral chasm. On the other side of us now is a felon, right? And the only difference between them and a million others of us that same day is a factor over which none of us had any control, namely the fortuity of a kid darting out from between two cars, for one, but for none of the others. And you cannot rationally explain why we blame the one guy who hit somebody from the million who happened not to. We could still get him for attempt, by the way. You know, if we wanted to be really consistent, that's what the MPC starts to do. But, you know, to get rid of bring some of the moral luck out. But I start there and I march through the criminal law and I start to point out, Bert, that at the end of the day, the self that we make our object of moral evaluation is nothing but a tissue of contingencies. From those kind of cases, examples of moral luck I gave you, result luck, to circumstantial luck, to constitutive luck. By the time you're done with it, you realize that much of what we're evaluated for, much of our moral record hangs on factors over which we have no control, and therefore are the result of the equivalent of a coin flip. Heads you're good, tails you're bad. Heads you're wicked, tails you're worthy, right? And once you really get your mind around that, I'm telling you, you know, I've had some good conversation with a lot of folks over in the philosophy departments around the country, and we've gone back and forth sometimes deep into the night. Once you get your mind around it, it is a paradox. It is a serious paradox. That's what they call it, a paradox, right? But it's true. It's a phenomenon that we can't get around or deny. And so I think that just that is one of the ways, without using free will. When determinists often talk about, is there free will here, isn't there? That's been going on for thousands of years, hundreds real seriously. I thought moral luck is an interesting way to get at the problem of, moral responsibility without using free will ideas at all. There are for moral luck, you need no free will ideas. You give everybody 100% free will, and you still have the phenomenon. And it's still as irrational and illegitimate as ever. So that's why I went that route in that chapter.
And one last question before we turn it over. If you could talk a little bit about your critique of Michelle Alexander, whose book, The New Jim Crow, has been an amazingly bestseller at Chevalier's Books, and where you think she fell short and where you would go from there.
Yeah, it's a very important book, and most important, I think, for turning the conversation, the national conversation when it came to civil rights, from what we were talking about, because I wrote a book back in '97, Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, 10 Costs of Being Black in America. Nobody wanted to hear anything about it. I was talking about the same kind of stuff. Nobody wanted to hear about it. I was standing up on tables in 2000, 2001. Mass incarceration. No, at the NAACP, they'd bring me out for the national convention, and there'd be a little discussion, a kind of polite discussion. But the main civil rights agenda was around things like affirmative action, things like housing. That's where the attention was going. And no one was wanting to hear about bad people making bad choices and landing in jails and cells being a civil rights issue. They just didn't see it as that, And so the new Jim Crow was able to tell people in a way that they hadn't been able to see before, that actually what we see going on in these prisons and jails is a form of social oppression, like the old Jim Crow, like segregation. Because people saw people in prison as victims of self-destruction, not social oppression. The old Jim Crow, segregation is about Martin, Medgar, and Rosa. Those are innocent blacks. Those are good Negroes, if you will. They're perfectly innocent blacks who are the victims of social oppression. They would say, over here in mass incarceration, you have criminals, most of them violent. By the way, we'll get to that in one moment, my critique of Michelle Alexander's book, who are preying often on the most vulnerable members of their own community. They'd say, I don't see the moral equivalence between Martin, Medgar, and Rosa on the one hand, and a gangbanger, a violent, assaulted, somebody who's committed violent assault and arsonist on the other. I just don't see the moral equivalence, right? And so especially those who are coming from the politics of respectability point of view, they're gonna say, I don't see the moral equivalence. And so, the new Jim Crow helped to rock that some by helping some people to see that actually those were victims of social oppression in jail and not just mere victims of self-destruction. They're really victims of social oppression. But here's how she got there. Her rhetorical move, and as lawyers, we can appreciate this, right? Her rhetorical move was to say, we went from 300,000 prisoners in 1980 to 2.2 million by the end of the aughts by arresting and convicting low-level nonviolent drug offenders. And I quoted in the book, I give the passage, and she says a number of other places throughout the book, right? And as John Pfaff points out in his book, Locked In, and others have pointed out, Mark Maurer and a number of other people. Professor Bazelon, I know, I'm sure can help, help us with any of the names of a lot of people have kind of started pointing out that actually, when you look at prisoners in the state system, which is where 87% of the prisoners are, only John Pfaff found only 5 to 60% of them are there for low-level nonviolent offenses or low-level nonviolent drug offenses in any way that you could characterize that way. And he said even that is an exaggerated number because a lot of times they're copping a plea. They could have come in for the domestic violence and they settled on the drug, offense. So at any rate, it's not a huge number. If you want to make deep cuts in racialized mass incarceration, it's not going to be by releasing a lot of low-level nonviolent drug offenders. When I take my students over to San Quentin, I just don't see them. And you're right up there where you are, Laura. I'm not seeing the low-level nonviolent drug offenders. I've been going up there for years. I haven't been seeing them. So what I'm saying is, what Michelle Alexander gained by saying the problem is one primarily of low-level nonviolent drug offenders, she gained a lot of rhetorical efficacy through that statement. But because it's factually not true, it's not going to help the population that most needs to be helped. And that is those who aren't there for low-level nonviolent drug offenses, those who are there for violent or serious offenses, which are, Pfaff points out, more than half each year. And, just for violent, and then you throw on serious on top of that, it's going to be a considerable chunk, right? If you're talking about making deep cuts, and not a lot of low-level nonviolent drug offenders are going to get it done, right? And so actually it may make things worse for those who are left behind because a lot of people are thinking, oh, we're solving the problem by just addressing low-level nonviolent drug offenders, or just low-level nonviolent offenders, forget the drugs. If we just address them, we'll be fine. The nons, right? Non-violent, non-sexual, non-serious. Okay, the First Steps Act, that's all we have to do. The First Steps Act is hell of a lot better than no step, but it's so far from being adequate, right? Because it's only addressing these nons and not dealing with this other problem. And so that's my criticism of Michelle Alexander, that it rests on a factual falsehood that actually redounds to the detriment of the serious and violent offenders who are left out of that narrative and who are then viewed by many others. And I used to get this from the inmates, I shouldn't call them that, the people in prison. And when I go up to San Quentin, who would say, I'm not a low-level nonviolent drug offender, professor, they're not talking about me. And all of these are reform talks, in fact, they're talking about me being the one who does really belong here. So that's what this book is about. If we want to make these deep cuts, we have to come up with a new moral compass, a new moral framework. And I try to map one out by looking at not only moral luck, but at law and coming up with a new theory of mens rea, a new model of mens rea in the law, and then kind of looking at, language and how it can help us, see beyond otherizing Blacks and see through the inwardization of them.
Amazing.
Professor Armour, thank you so much. Bert, I don't know if you wanted to take us out with some closing remarks, but I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation tonight.
So I will only say that it was every bit as scintillating as I had been imagining it for the last 3 weeks since we've set this up. The book is an incredibly interesting, provocative, important work, and I couldn't imagine a better interlocutor than Professor Bazelon to bring out the best of Professor Armour. So I thank both of you for doing this for Chevaliers, and I thank those of you who attended for being here tonight. Thank you very, very much. Really great evening.
So much. Have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you.